What happens when a billionaire goes on a business trip and the hotel only has one room left? But this isn't the story you think it is. This isn't about passion in the dark or sudden confessions. It's about something far more fragile and far more rare. It's about a man who spent 7 years alone after losing the only woman he ever loved, and a woman who stopped believing she was worth loving again. It's about silence, about grief, about peppermint tea, a single bed, and a question neither of them dares to ask: can two people, broken in different ways, find something worth staying for? When Daniel Whitmore, a wealthy and private architect, takes his assistant Claire on a trip to Charleston, a booking mistake places them in the same room. What begins as an awkward night becomes a quiet unraveling of two guarded lives. No promises, no perfect endings. Just slow mornings, small glances, and the choice to stay. If you've ever been afraid to love again, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin the story. Sometimes the most unexpected complications open doors we didn't know were still locked. And for Daniel Whitmore and Claire Bennett, it all began with a single room and a storm rolling in from the sea. They arrived in Charleston 2 hours later than expected. The flight from New York had been delayed by low clouds and steady drizzle, and by the time they landed, night had already folded itself over the city like a heavy quilt. The air was warm but damp, thick with the scent of salt and magnolia. Claire's shoes were damp from the puddles they had walked through at the airport curb. Daniel hadn't spoken much on the ride from the airport, staring out the window as the taxi wound its way through narrow streets lined with old brick and gas lanterns. Inside the hotel, the lobby was dimly lit, with paneled wood and brass fixtures that carried a kind of old Southern charm. Claire stepped ahead to the front desk, adjusting the collar of her rain-damp blouse. The clerk, a young man with apologetic eyes, typed quickly on his keyboard, frowned, then gave them a careful smile. "I'm so sorry," he said. "It looks like we've had some booking issues due to the storm. There's only one room left, one of our older suites. Queen bed, river view." Claire blinked. "Only one room." Daniel stepped forward, his tone quiet but firm. "We booked 2. I understand, sir, but we've had unexpected overbookings. The storm grounded several other flights. Everyone's come in late, just like you." Claire turned slightly toward Daniel, uncertainty in her expression. "We could check another hotel. I can make a call." But Daniel shook his head slowly. His voice was low, tired in a way that made her pause. "It's almost midnight. Claire, we'll figure it out." She nodded without replying, her fingers closing over the hotel key card as the clerk handed it to her. Suite 207. Upstairs, river view, one bed. The elevator creaked as it ascended. Neither of them spoke. Claire's heart was steady, but loud in her chest. She could hear the soft tap of rain against the narrow windows in the hallway as they stepped out and walked toward the suite. The carpet was thick and burgundy, muffling their footsteps. The old hotel smelled faintly of cedar and lavender and old paper. Inside, the room greeted them with the soft glow of 2 amber lamps and the distant sound of rain against the glass. It was a lovely room. Claire noted distantly antique armoire, hardwood floors, pale blue wallpaper lined with faded white florals. The bed sat squarely in the middle, dressed in white linens with a woven tan throw folded at the foot. There was only one chair near the window, one desk, one bed. Daniel placed his briefcase on the small table near the door, his movements slow but deliberate. Claire moved to the coat rack, her fingers brushing over the wooden hooks as she hung her trench coat, damp at the shoulders. Her hair, pinned loosely, had begun to fall in strands down the back of her neck. He loosened his tie in silence. She reached for her phone, checked the time, 12:17 a.m., then placed it face down on the nightstand. "It's just one night," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel nodded. "We'll manage." But it was more than logistics that filled the space between them. It was the quiet understanding of proximity of what it meant to share a room with someone who, until now, had only existed in the structured boundaries of meetings, flights, and polished workdays. Daniel was her boss. Claire was his assistant. They had built a rapport of mutual respect, of quiet efficiency. But now, here, in a room softened by lamplight and framed by the sounds of rain and wind curling through the old window panes, none of that felt as certain. She sat on the edge of the bed, unsure whether to remove her shoes, unsure whether to ask him if he wanted the bed or the chair. He had already moved toward the armchair near the window, lifting the small pillow from the bed to rest against the worn upholstery. "You can take the bed," he said, without looking at her. She nodded. "Thank you." Outside, thunder rolled distantly, not loud but present, the kind that hums in your chest and makes the walls feel closer. Claire pulled back the covers, slid beneath them fully clothed, then turned toward the wall, her hands tucked under her cheek. She listened for a moment to the quiet creak of Daniel settling into the chair, to the sigh of the rain, to the silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable, but wasn't familiar either. Somewhere deep inside her, something softened and stirred, like a door she didn't realize had been locked gently sliding open. She stared at the shadows moving across the ceiling, unsure whether it was the long day, the odd intimacy of the moment, or simply the storm, but she felt wide awake. And as she closed her eyes, she realized this wasn't just one night. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. He took the armchair, she took the bed, and the silence between them was louder than any thunder outside. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the old window panes, like a memory tapping gently on the glass. In the dim golden light of the bedside lamp, the room felt older than it was, like a story that had been paused and was just now being picked up again. Daniel had removed his jacket, folded it neatly over the back of the armchair. His tie lay draped across the narrow table beneath the window. Claire watched as he moved, quiet and deliberate, as though trying not to disturb something sacred in the stillness. She stood beside the bed, folding a soft beige throw blanket in half, then again, smoothing its corners. She walked over to the armchair and held it out for him. "For your legs," she said softly. He looked up at her, eyes warm but unreadable. "Thank you?" "Claire. But I'll be fine." She didn't insist. She only nodded and placed the blanket gently on the arm of the chair, her fingers brushing the worn fabric for a moment longer than necessary. He sat down slowly, the old chair creaking under his weight, and let out the kind of sigh that didn't quite belong to the body. It came from somewhere deeper. Claire returned to the bed, slipped beneath the covers, still in her clothes, and adjusted the lamp until the room was lit just enough to feel like nighttime, but not quite darkness. "Long day," she said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, stretching his legs out. "Very long." Claire rolled onto her side to face the room, her hands tucked beneath her cheek. "I didn't think we'd make it in tonight, neither did I," he said, "but here we are." A small smile passed between them, brief and soft. She looked toward the window. "You travel often." He shook his head. "Not as much as people assume. I like being home, even when home is empty." The words came out before she could stop them, too honest to take back. There was a pause, not heavy, but honest, especially then. He said. She turned her gaze back to the ceiling, letting the silence take its space. There was something in the way he spoke that felt familiar, not his tone, but the weight behind his words, like someone who had once known laughter but hadn't used it in a while. Daniel leaned his head back, eyes closed. "I'm not good at sleeping in hotels," he said after a while. "Too many unfamiliar sounds." Claire glanced toward the window. "Rain helps," she murmured. "Feels like it's washing things clean." He didn't respond, but the quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things unsaid, small truths passed like folded notes in the dark. From where she lay, Claire could see the edge of his phone resting on the windowsill. The screen lit up once as he turned it on, revealing a photograph that she could only glimpse for a second. A woman's face smiling, timeless, then darkness again. He said nothing, but the gesture lingered in the air like incense. She closed her eyes, Not because she was tired, but because looking at him in that moment felt too intimate. The space between them, measured not in inches but in memories, was both too close and too far. The wind picked up outside, rustling through the trees just beyond the window. The old wood of the room groaned softly in response. Somewhere downstairs, a door clicked shut. Footsteps passed in the hallway above them. Every sound stood out clearly in the stillness, each one another reminder of where they were and where they weren't. Claire shifted beneath the blanket. Her body ached not just from travel, but from the effort of holding herself so carefully together. It was the kind of ache that came not from movement, but from restraint. And then she heard it. A quiet breath. A long, slow exhale from the armchair. Not dramatic, not sorrowful, just tired. Claire opened her eyes, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time, she realized that Daniel wasn't just alone in his life. He was lonely in it. There was a difference. She had always seen him as composed, polished, collected, but now, in the worn curve of his posture, in the soft thud of his phone placed gently on the table, in that barely audible sigh, she saw a man who hadn't let anyone close enough to see how much he missed being known. The rain grew heavier, pelting against the glass in steady waves. Thunder murmured in the distance. Claire turned away from the room and faced the wall, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. She didn't know what she felt. Or maybe she did but wasn't ready to name it. It was part empathy, part tenderness, and something else. Something that flickered softly in her chest, like a candle not yet lit, but waiting. She closed her eyes, listening not to the storm, but to the silence between them. It was no longer uncomfortable. Some mornings bring clarity, others bring memories you thought you'd buried. The sky outside the window was still wrapped in gray when Claire opened her eyes. The room held that early hush that only exists just before the world wakes up soft and still, like a held breath. The rain had stopped, though the windows were beaded with the remains of the night's storm, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and wood polish. She moved quietly, careful not to wake Daniel. He was still in the armchair, his head tilted slightly to the side, one arm resting across his chest, the other hanging limply over the edge. The blanket she had left for him was still folded neatly on the armrest, untouched. Claire padded across the room, barefoot, her steps muted against the hardwood floor. She found the small coffee station near the armoire, an old-fashioned drip machine. Nothing fancy. She filled it with water from the bottle by the sink, unwrapped a packet of ground beans, and paused for a moment as the aroma hit her. Cinnamon. A hint of toasted hazelnut. Something sweet beneath the bitterness. She smiled quietly. It reminded her of her mother's kitchen. And, oddly, it also reminded her of something else, something she couldn't place. The machine began to sputter and breathe, filling the room with its low gurgling sound and the comforting smell of morning. Claire reached for 2 ceramic mugs and wiped them with a napkin. She moved slowly, not because she had to, but because slowness felt like the right pace in that moment. Behind her, she heard Daniel stir, a quiet breath, the creak of the chair, then, his voice still thick with sleep but clear. "That smell," he said softly. "I haven't had that in years." Claire turned, holding out a cup. It's the only blend they had. He took it with both hands, nodding slightly. "My wife used to make this exact kind, before she got sick." She said it reminded her of Christmas mornings. Claire didn't reply. She just sat down at the edge of the bed with her own mug and held it between her palms like it was something fragile. They drank in silence for a few moments. The rain had returned, just a drizzle now, barely audible. Outside the window, the branches of the trees swayed gently. A squirrel darted across the edge of the stone wall, pausing to shake water from its fur. Daniel took another sip. "I don't think I've had a slow morning like this in maybe a decade." Claire smiled faintly. "Most mornings, I don't even taste my coffee. It's just part of the checklist." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You seem thoughtful this morning." She paused, then said, I was just remembering something I haven't thought about in a long time. He waited, quietly, the kind of silence that invites rather than presses. When I was in college, Claire began, I wanted to design healing spaces, hospitals, retirement homes, rehab centers, places where people go when they're hurting. I thought if I could make them feel more like home, maybe healing would be easier. Daniel nodded, slowly. I was so sure. She continued. I had binders full of sketches, color palettes inspired by wildflowers, furniture layouts based on human movement and memory. She let out a soft laugh, but nobody believed in it. Professors said it was too idealistic. My parents didn't understand why I didn't want to do commercial buildings. And then life just got in the way. He was quiet, but his gaze held her. I dropped the program in my third year, she said, told myself it didn't matter. That stability mattered more. That I'd grow into it, I didn't. Daniel set his mug down on the windowsill. Did anyone ever tell you they believed you could do it? That it mattered? Claire met his eyes. There was no pity in his expression, only a stillness that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected. No, she said. Not really. He was quiet for a long beat. Then let me be the first. Something in her chest tightened too sharp to be comfort, too gentle to be pain. She looked away and smiled, a small, wistful thing. I used to wear this red scarf all the time, she said. Even in spring, people thought it was silly, but I wore it like armor. Daniel smiled faintly. Why red, I don't know. It made me feel bold, like I was capable of more than I was told. And now, Claire exhaled. Now, I don't wear the scarf anymore. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched her in the quiet, the way she looked away when she was unsure. The way her fingers curled around her mug like they were holding something heavier than coffee. They finished their breakfast quietly. Claire unpacked her portfolio and notes for the conference presentation. Daniel offered to review them, but she declined, said she needed to feel like she still knew what she was doing. When it was time to leave the room, Claire grabbed her blazer, brushed a wrinkle from the sleeve, and turned to check her reflection in the mirror by the door. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, watching not her reflection, but her. She glanced back at him, smiled politely. I'll be downstairs in 5, she said, and then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving the soft scent of cinnamon and quiet history behind her. Daniel didn't move for a long time. He picked up his mug, now cooling, and looked toward the chair where her scarf might have been, had she brought one. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered if he might want to help someone believe in color again. Nothing ruins fragile hope quite like the past, showing up dressed in pearls and confidence. The banquet hall shimmered with low chandeliers and the quiet hum of polite conversation. Laughter spilled from one corner to another like champagne effervescent, polished and practiced. Daniel moved through the crowd with his usual quiet grace, nodding at familiar faces from industry boards, long-forgotten conferences, and the occasional alumni event. It was networking at its finest cordial, strategic, impersonal. Claire had kept to herself most of the evening, nursing a single glass of club soda by the buffet table. Her name tag had curled slightly at the corner, and she'd smoothed it 3 times without realizing. She watched him speak with a group near the fireplace. He looked so at ease in a setting like this, as though he belonged to this world of handshakes and tailored suits. And then she appeared, Linda Hallbrook, the kind of woman who seemed born in heels, draped in soft ivory silk, her hair pinned like a magazine spread, pearls resting just below her collarbone. She moved with the certainty of someone who had never been asked to doubt herself. Dan, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter like a song people hadn't heard in years. She didn't ask for his attention, she simply claimed it. Daniel turned, blinking. There was a brief flicker in his eyes. Hard to name nostalgia, maybe, or something more cautious. Linda, he said, no warmth, but not cold either. I almost didn't recognize you without a blue folder in your hands, she teased, leaning in as though the years between them were just a footnote. Claire watched from a distance, her hand tightening around the slim glass. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. Linda reached out and touched his arm lightly, the way only people with long histories and unspoken assumptions do. Then, laughter, Linda's, bright, familiar, practiced. She leaned close and murmured something, and Claire saw Daniel's mouth curve, whether from amusement or discomfort. She couldn't tell, but the image was sealed to people who had shared too much to pretend they hadn't. Claire didn't wait to see more. She placed her glass down gently on the table, careful not to let it clink, and made her way through the crowd without a word. The hallway outside was quieter, dimly lit, with shadows stretching long across the marble floor. She walked past the elevator, then paused by a window overlooking the garden, where string lights still flickered despite the mist that clung to the glass. She didn't cry, but she stood still for a long time, her arms crossed, her heart somewhere between disappointment and shame for even feeling disappointed in the first place. It was foolish, she told herself that. Whatever was blooming between her and Daniel had no promises, no definitions. Still, some part of her had begun to hope for something gentle, something hers. Back in the banquet room, Daniel finally stepped away from Linda. He hadn't planned to see her, hadn't even thought about her in years. They dated briefly after his wife passed, but it hadn't lasted. Too much history without enough foundation. He scanned the room, and it took only seconds to realize Claire was gone. He walked quickly toward the hallway, eyes moving past small groups and conversations. Then he saw the outline of her shoulder as she turned a corner, heading toward the elevators. By the time he reached the room, the door was closed. He hesitated, then entered quietly, the soft click of the lock behind him feeling louder than it should have. Claire was already in bed, back turned, the room dimly lit by the bedside lamp she hadn't bothered to switch off. She didn't speak. He crossed the room, unsure what to say, unsure if saying anything would help or make things worse. His footsteps were slow. The chair from last night still sat near the window, but he didn't move toward it. She looked still, too still. And then he saw it, the glint of moisture on her cheek catching the edge of the lamp's light. Her breathing wasn't deep enough for sleep. She was pretending, or rather, she was protecting. Daniel stood there for a moment, guilt settling into his chest like wet concrete. He remembered something his late wife had once said, long before she fell ill. Don't ever let someone feel small just because someone from your past walks in the room, especially if the one beside you is the one who stayed. He had failed at that tonight. Not intentionally, but failure doesn't always come with malice sometimes. It comes with absence. He stepped closer, reached out, and let his hand hover just above Claire's shoulder, just enough to feel the warmth of her through the blanket. His fingers grazed the fabric, paused, then he pulled back. She didn't turn. Didn't speak, but she knew he was there, and somehow, that made it worse. Daniel crossed the room, took the chair again, and sat down quietly. The rain had returned. Outside, the garden lights still glowed, blurry through the wet glass. In the silence, something fragile had cracked, and neither of them knew if it could be mended. Not all storms come from the sky. Some come from the things we never said when we should have. The morning had passed quietly, too quietly. Claire had gone through the motions conference notes, emails, a polite lunch with a junior designer from Atlanta, but her thoughts drifted, always returning to the night before. The image of Linda's hand on Daniel's arm, the look on his face, the silence between them after, by late afternoon, the sky over Charleston had begun to bruise with gray again, the kind of sky that holds its breath before letting go. Daniel hadn't seen Claire since breakfast, and he hadn't tried to explain what she'd seen in the banquet hall, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know where to begin. She had looked at him with something fragile in her eyes, and he hadn't had the words ready in time. But now, as the light faded, he found himself walking the narrow stone path toward the Riverwalk. It had rained earlier, he could still smell it in the air, that green, earthy scent of wet leaves and distant thunder. He knew she might be there, It was where they'd walked their first evening before everything had gotten tangled in memory and misunderstanding. And she was there, standing at the far edge of the promenade, where the railing overlooked the slow-moving river. Her arms were crossed, not tightly, but enough to suggest she was holding something in. Her scarf had come undone and hung loose, caught slightly in the wind. She didn't turn when he approached. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet lap of the river below and the rustling of trees overhead. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly, still looking ahead. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," he replied. She glanced sideways. "I didn't say I didn't." "I know," he said, but sometimes silence feels louder than anything. They stood that way for a moment, longer two people caught between uncertainty and the unspoken weight of something becoming real. Then, her voice, steadier this time. "Did you ever love someone after your wife?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He turned to face the river, his hands resting on the cool iron railing. He watched the water move slow, steady, as if time itself were passing downstream. "I've dated," he said finally. "Even tried to convince myself a few times that I was ready. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I don't think I ever let anyone get close enough to answer that question." Claire nodded, saying nothing. "But lately," he continued, "I've been thinking about things I haven't thought about in years. Small things, like what makes someone's shoulders relax, or how it feels when a room doesn't feel empty, even in silence." The wind picked up slightly, lifting strands of her hair. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, "but I know I want to learn. If it's with you—" Claire turned to him, eyes searching not for charm or promises, but for truth. The first drop of rain landed on her wrist. They both looked up. The clouds had thickened, and the drizzle was beginning again, soft and hesitant, like the sky wasn't sure whether to cry or let go completely. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she stepped closer and slipped her hand into his. His fingers tightened around hers almost instinctively, like they'd been waiting. And then, without planning it, without permission or panic, she leaned in, and he met her there. The kiss wasn't cinematic. It wasn't sweeping or orchestrated or designed to make hearts race. It was brief, gentle, warm. It tasted of river air and new beginnings. There was no trembling, no dramatics, just a shared breath and a moment where neither had to pretend they weren't scared and didn't have to hide it anymore. When they pulled apart, they didn't say anything. The rain continued, light and steady, soaking into their jackets, their hair, but they didn't move, didn't run for cover. They simply stood there, hand in hand, letting the storm fall softly around them. It wasn't about romance. It was about surrender. And for the first time, both of them stood in the open not because it was safe, but because they weren't afraid to be seen. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't falling in love. It's believing you still deserve to. They didn't speak on the walk back to the hotel. There wasn't silence between them. Not really. There was something softer, like a song winding down to its final notes, like the hush after laughter, when no one wants to break the calm. Their hands remained loosely intertwined, not clinging, just holding as if to say, "We're still here." The lobby was nearly empty when they stepped in, rainwater glistening on their coats. Claire's hair clung slightly to her neck. Daniel's shoes left damp prints on the old tile floor. Neither noticed, neither cared. Upstairs, the hallway stretched ahead with a golden glow from the antique sconces. Claire unlocked the door with steady fingers, and they stepped inside. The room welcomed them with a familiar dimness, the same soft lamplight, the same creak in the floorboard near the bed. Claire moved first, hanging her jacket, towing off her wet flats. Daniel placed his phone on the desk without looking at it. No new emails, no calls, nothing urgent, and yet everything inside him felt urgent. But he said nothing. He moved toward the armchair, just like the nights before, but paused halfway. "You don't have to," Claire said, her voice barely louder than the hush outside the window. "I know," he replied, "but maybe tonight. It's where I should be. She didn't argue. Instead, she pulled the throw blanket from the foot of the bed, the one he had refused the first night, and walked over. She unfolded it gently and placed it over his shoulders after he sat. Daniel looked up at her, eyes steady, not questioning, not insisting, just present. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Tomorrow's your big presentation." He smiled faintly. "Ours." Claire tilted her head. "I'm not on the panel. You might not be speaking," he said, "but I don't think I could face that room without knowing you're somewhere in it." She sat on the edge of the bed, facing him. The window behind her glowed faintly with the city's distant lights, and the wind moved gently against the old panes. "I never thought I'd trust someone enough to start over," she said after a while. "I told myself I didn't need to." Daniel's voice was soft. "Me neither." There was a pause, not heavy, just full. He shifted slightly, resting one hand over the armrest. "Claire, when I lost her, when my wife passed, I stopped letting people get close. It wasn't anger. It was just a quiet shutting down." She looked at him, not with pity, with knowing. "I used to think healing was about forgetting," he continued, "but maybe it's more about remembering without the ache." Claire let out a slow breath. "I think it's about having something to look forward to again." The wind picked up outside, brushing against the building like a whisper. Inside, everything was still. They didn't move toward each other. They didn't need to. Something between them had already moved, unspoken, but known. Daniel leaned his head back, eyes closing for a moment. "I've given speeches to hundreds of people," he murmured. "But tomorrow, I just want to look down from that stage and see you there." Claire felt something flutter in her chest. Not excitement, not nerves, just a warmth, like coming inside after a long walk in the cold, like being invited to stay. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. She reached for the lamp beside her and turned it off. The room fell into darkness slowly. The kind of darkness that doesn't feel lonely. The kind that wraps around you like a blanket and lets you rest. The rain had stopped, but the trees still rustled outside. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed, a distant elevator dinged. Inside, there were only 2 steady heartbeats, and the quiet comfort of 2 people choosing not to run. Claire slipped beneath the covers, eyes wide open in the dark. She couldn't see Daniel, but she could hear him shift, breathe, settle into sleep, and in the stillness, something settled in her too. Not resolution, not certainty, just peace. The night didn't promise anything, but it didn't take anything away, either, and for now, that was enough. It wasn't the speeches or the standing ovations. It was the quiet glance between them in the hotel room that changed everything. The morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains, gentle and golden, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. Charleston had shaken off the rain, and in its place came a soft breeze that rustled the trees and carried the scent of wet brick and blooming jasmine. Daniel stood by the desk, tying his tie with slower hands than usual, the same navy one he always wore for big presentations. But something about him felt different this morning, more deliberate, more present, and yet more unsettled. Claire watched him from the mirror, pretending to check her bag, but really noticing how he kept adjusting the knot, then undoing it again. "You've done this 100 times," she said gently. Her tone meant to soothe, not question. Daniel gave a short exhale, not quite a laugh. "That's what worries me. I've done it so many times, I'm not sure I remember how to care." She turned, came closer, and handed him the final printouts of the slides. "Then, maybe this time, it matters more because you do." He looked at her, really looked, her hair pulled back loosely, the silver pin in her blazer lapel, the calm in her gaze. There was something quietly grounding about her presence, like an anchor he hadn't realized he'd needed. They walked down together, but didn't speak much on the way. In the elevator, Claire straightened his jacket collar without asking. and Daniel looked down at her with a softness that made the space between them feel smaller. The ballroom was already buzzing when they arrived, voices rising and falling in practiced rhythms, people checking phones, reviewing notes, sipping from travel mugs. Claire found a seat near the back, where the view was clear, but the exit was still close. Daniel stepped toward the stage, his movements more fluid now. As he turned to take his place behind the podium, he searched the crowd, and then he saw her, Claire, sitting with both hands folded in her lap, shoulders square, eyes steady on him. That look not performative, not proud, but simply present. It was enough, more than enough. The presentation began, his voice measured, calm, his points precise, but it wasn't the data or the diagrams that held the room. It was the way he spoke about spaces that breathe, about buildings that heal, about structures designed for dignity rather than profit, about believing that architecture wasn't just lines and load-bearing walls, but choices that shaped how people lived, grieved, hoped. When the last slide faded and the room rose in applause, Daniel let his eyes drift back to where Claire sat. She didn't clap the hardest. She didn't need to. Her smile quiet, proud, and knowing was the only ovation he heard. Later, after the questions and the handshakes, the conference lunch, and the short walk through the sunlit lobby, they returned to the hotel room. It felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because now they had. Daniel loosened his tie as he stepped inside, but this time, his fingers faltered halfway. Claire noticed from where she stood by the window, slipping off her heels, rotating her ankles slowly like a dancer after curtain call. "Here," she said, walking over. "Let me—" He turned toward her. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Hesitation, vulnerability, or perhaps just the quiet weight of trust. She reached up, her fingers brushing the soft fabric of his tie, and gently tugged the knot loose. Her movements were slow, careful, not because she didn't know how, but because she didn't want to rush the moment. The silk slid free, and she folded it in half before setting it on the desk. For a few seconds, they stood close, the kind of close that didn't need to be filled with words. Then Daniel spoke. "I think," he began, voice quieter now, "if my wife were still here, she would have liked you." Claire didn't look up right away. The words settled between them like dust in late afternoon light, soft, shimmering, impossible to ignore. When she did meet his eyes, hers were glassy, not from pain, but from being seen, truly seen. She didn't say anything. Instead, she reached for his hand, squeezed it gently just once and let go. Not because she was leaving, but because she didn't need to hold on for him to know. He nodded, just barely. The late sun spilled across the room, golden and warm, and somewhere outside, the trees whispered with the wind again. It wasn't the moment people write about. It wasn't dramatic, or loud, or certain, but it was the moment everything quietly changed. When does something stop being professional and start becoming personal? The conference dinner was still in full swing when Daniel leaned toward Claire and said, "Let's not go." She blinked. "You mean—" "The gala," he nodded. "I've had enough name tags and catered hors d'oeuvres for one day." Claire tilted her head, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "And where would we go instead? There's a place I found during a morning run. Small, by the river, candlelight, real linen napkins, and no keynote speakers. So they slipped away, quietly, no grand exits, no goodbyes, just two people stepping out of obligation and into something else. The restaurant was tucked behind a row of old buildings, its wooden sign swaying gently in the breeze. A narrow porch overlooked the water, and the clink of glassware mixed with the lull of evening waves. Inside, the lights were low, the tables spaced far apart, and the servers spoke in soft voices. They were shown to a table near a window. Claire folded her napkin over her lap, smoothing it unconsciously. She wasn't nervous, but the air between them had shifted, become more delicate, more open, no more walls to hide behind. Daniel set his phone face down beside his fork. Claire noticed and smiled. "I'm honored," she said lightly. You should be, he replied. That phone has controlled most of my adult life. The menus were simple fresh catch, root vegetables, house-baked bread. But it wasn't about the food. It was about space, about sitting across from someone with no emails to answer, no deadlines to meet, just time. They ordered. He chose grilled trout with lemon butter. She, a warm salad with goat cheese and roasted squash. When the server left, there was a moment of stillness. Then Daniel spoke. She used to draw my buildings for me. Claire looked up. My wife, he added gently. Emily. I'd sketch things rough, fast, more idea than structure, and she'd take them and make them beautiful. She saw softness where I saw sharp lines. Claire rested her chin lightly on her hand. Did she teach you how to slow down? He chuckled. She tried. I think I'm just now learning how. Their meals arrived, steam rising, plates warm to the touch. Claire picked up her fork, but didn't eat right away. There was a nursery, she said softly, painted soft green. I'd picked the color before we even knew if it was a boy or a girl. Daniel looked at her, saying nothing, giving her the silence she needed. I lost the baby at 16 weeks, she continued, and the next week, my husband left. Daniel's throat tightened. Claire, it's okay, she said, shaking her head. It was a long time ago. But after that, I couldn't design anymore, not even for myself. I'd open my sketchbook and see that room, every time. He reached across the table, not touching her hand, but letting his own rest near enough to be noticed. I didn't mean to tell you that, she added. It's just, tonight feels different. He nodded. It is, for a while. They ate quietly, the kind of silence that follows deep truths, not awkward, just sacred. Then Daniel asked, Do you think people can start over? Claire met his eyes. The candlelight flickered between them. I think, only if they don't start alone. He exhaled, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Then maybe I finally have a chance. She smiled, but it didn't reach her lips. It lingered behind her eyes, instead. The kind of smile that says, I see you. I'm still here. They finished their meals slowly. Shared a dessert, neither of them admitted they wanted a warm apple tart with cinnamon cream. He insisted on the last bite. She let him win. When the check came, Daniel signed without looking at the total. Claire didn't pretend to reach for her purse. Outside, the night had cooled. The breeze carried the scent of river water and fallen leaves. The sidewalk glistened faintly under the street lamps, still wet from the rain earlier in the day. They walked side by side, not touching, not speaking, but their footsteps matched in rhythm, and their shadows, long and faint, fell closer than ever before. At one point, Daniel reached up to loosen his collar, and Claire's hand brushed his sleeve as if by accident, but neither pulled away. The hotel came into view, and still, they didn't speak, because sometimes the deepest things are said in the quiet. Some truths are easier to write than to say out loud. The morning Charleston said goodbye was gray, but not cold, just soft. The kind of morning where everything seemed quieter than usual, as if the city itself was being careful not to disturb something fragile. Claire sat at the small wooden desk in their hotel room, a cup of peppermint tea growing cold beside her, her suitcase already zipped shut by the door. In front of her lay a single sheet of hotel stationery off-white, slightly textured, with the name of the inn pressed in gold at the top. She held the pen for a long time before writing anything. Then, slowly, carefully, she began, Dear Daniel, I wasn't going to write this. I thought I could leave without saying anything that would make this harder. But some feelings are too quiet to speak out loud, too tender to risk misunderstanding. So, here they are, in ink. I'm scared, not of you, not of what's between us, but of believing, after everything, that I might still be capable of loving someone again. And yet, if there's one person who makes me want to try, who makes me think maybe it's worth the risk, it's you. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'll never forget this version of me. The one I found beside you. C. She folded the letter once, then again. No envelope, just a soft crease and her initials at the bottom corner. She didn't mean to leave it behind. She had tucked it into the drawer of the nightstand, unsure whether to give it to him or throw it away. And in the rush of checkout room keys, forgotten charger, the car waiting downstairs, it stayed where it was. Daniel found it 10 minutes later. He was checking drawers out of habit, a final sweep. The soft rectangle of paper lay beneath a folded hand towel. He didn't open it, didn't unfold it. His thumb brushed the edge of the fold, just long enough to see her neat, unmistakable handwriting. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence of the now empty room wrap around him like memory. Then he slipped the letter into the inside pocket of his jacket and walked out. The airport was its usual blur, people rushing, announcements echoing, rolling suitcases rattling across tiled floors. But Claire and Daniel moved more slowly, deliberately, as if they were the only ones not late for something. Their flight was on time, a rare gift. They sat side by side on the plane, she by the window, he in the aisle. Between them, the shared armrest went unused. Their shoulders nearly touched, but didn't. Not until the plane lifted off and leveled in the sky. When Daniel quietly reached across and took her hand. No words, just fingers laced, warm and steady. Claire turned slightly, enough to meet his eyes. There was no need to explain. He hadn't read the letter, but somehow, he already knew what it said. She smiled, small and real. The clouds drifted beneath them like slow-moving waves. The hum of the engines became background to their silence, comfortable, companionable. Claire reached for her purse, meaning to grab a pack of gum, but her fingers brushed against something tucked deep inside an old ticket stub. She pulled it out slowly. A museum exhibit. Abstract landscapes. 2 years ago. The date was circled in blue ink. She had planned to go with her husband, well, ex-husband now. It was the day they'd had their last real fight. The day she realized he never wanted to understand the quiet parts of her. She stared at the ticket for a long time. Then, without ceremony, she folded it once, stood, and walked down the aisle toward the restroom. As she passed the galley, she paused by the small metal bin and dropped it in. Just like that. No dramatic gesture, no second thoughts. She walked back to her seat lighter, not in posture, but in spirit. Daniel didn't ask, but he saw the difference. It was in her face, her eyes, the way she breathed easier. When she sat down, he looked at her a moment longer than necessary, and nodded. He understood. She had just chosen something, or rather, someone more important than the past. Not by declaration, not with fanfare, just with a small, quiet letting go. Sometimes, home is the person who brings you peace even in silence. New York returned like muscle memory. The cab ride from the airport, the blur of buildings, the familiar hum of urgency in the air, it all slipped back into place around Claire like a coat she hadn't worn in years, but still remembered how to fasten. Monday came. She sat at her usual desk, on the same floor, in the same building, surrounded by the same quiet hustle of people chasing deadlines. The hum of the copier, the gentle thud of someone's coffee cup landing on a desk, it was all exactly as it had been. Except she wasn't. Daniel, for his part, had returned to meetings and boardrooms as if the quiet nights in Charleston had been pages from someone else's journal. He greeted her with a nod that was neither distant nor familiar, just neutral. No mention of candlelit dinners, no nod to folded letters, no hand reaching for hers on a flight above the clouds. And that was okay. Because something inside Claire had shifted. She no longer needed confirmation to believe what she felt had been real. Still, that didn't mean it didn't ache a little, this return to normalcy. The way people pretend they never shared something tender in the dark, as if the office walls erase softness. It was mid-morning when the email arrived. Subject position, change notification. Internal reassignment from Human Resources. To Claire Bennett. Her heart stuttered. For a split second, her fingers hovered over the trackpad. unsure if she'd clicked something by mistake, but the words didn't vanish. Effective next month, your role will transition to Creative Project Manager for the Sebago Senior Living Development, project based in Maine, reporting to Daniel Whitmore. She blinked, read it again, and again, then stood. She didn't knock on Daniel's door. She walked straight in. He looked up, unsurprised, almost as if he'd been waiting. "You approve this?" she asked, voice steady but quiet. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "I did." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted it to be your choice. Not something you said yes to because you felt like you owed me anything." Claire stood there, arms crossed, trying to keep her breath even. Sebago. "That's huge." "I know. I'm not," she hesitated. "I'm not an architect anymore." Daniel smiled, gently. "No, you're not. You're someone who knows how space makes people feel. And this project isn't just about design. It's about heart, compassion, dignity." He stood then, walked around the desk, not imposing, just present. "I need someone who understands what it means to create a place that feels like coming home. And I don't know anyone who understands that better than you." Claire looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "You could have picked anyone," she said. "I didn't want anyone," he replied. "I wanted you." The words weren't romantic, they weren't dramatic, but they rooted somewhere deep in her, like warmth in the ribs, like light coming through old shutters. She nodded, not because she fully believed in herself yet, but because someone else did, and sometimes. That's where it begins. That evening, her apartment welcomed her like an old friend. She hung up her coat, slipped off her shoes, and walked into the kitchen. It was a small space-worn tile, a kettle with a slightly chipped handle, a radio older than her, but it felt safe. She turned the dial, faint jazz filtered in, crackling softly. She reached for the peppermint tea. The scent rose as the water steeped, familiar and calming. As she waited, she opened her window slightly, letting in the cool air from the city below. Car horns, footsteps, the distant bark of a dog. It was all still there, but inside her, everything had changed. She wrapped her hands around the mug, leaning slightly against the counter. For a moment, she didn't think, she just felt not anxious, not afraid, just ready. Then the phone on the counter buzzed. She didn't jump for it. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times, and when she finally picked it up, her voice was steady. "Hi," she said softly, "because sometimes you don't need grand confessions. Sometimes healing sounds like a simple word at the end of a long day." And in that quiet kitchen, with steam rising and the city breathing below, Claire knew she wasn't just waiting for a call. She was finally letting herself be found. Autumn had arrived, and with it, a quiet kind of beginning. The road curved gently along the lake's edge, flanked by trees just starting to turn gold, amber, rust. The air was crisp, not yet cold, and carried the scent of pine and earth. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting on the window ledge, fingertips brushing the cool glass as the scenery passed by. 3 months had passed since Charleston, since folded letters, mint tea, and the quiet space between two people becoming something more. Now, here she was. Maine, Sebago. Daniel had told her little about the place, just that it was near the project site and a bit older than it looks. But when he turned into the gravel drive and the house came into view, Claire's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't grand, it wasn't new, but it was right. White clapboard siding, a sloping roof, a chimney that hinted at crackling fires to come. The lake shimmered just beyond the back deck, framed by tall birch trees whose leaves fluttered like golden coins. Claire stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. The wind carried a faint hush through the trees, like the world asking for a moment of reverence. Daniel came around and unlocked the door. "Come on in." Inside, the house was warm with wood tones and quiet light. Wide plank floors stretched beneath soft rugs, and the living room opened toward a wall of windows overlooking the lake. The furniture was minimal comfortable, lived in, not curated. Claire moved slowly, taking it in. A kitchen with hanging copper pans and an old ceramic sink, a hallway with framed sketches, some architectural, some almost childlike in their looseness. A narrow staircase leading to what she assumed were the bedrooms. Daniel walked ahead, but let her set the pace. "I didn't buy it for show," he said. "I bought it because I could imagine someone opening the door and thinking, 'This feels safe.'" Claire smiled faintly. "It does." They moved through the house like two people tracing the edges of something unspoken. He paused at a small room off the back hallway. "This one," he said, "was a storage room. But I thought, maybe something else." He opened the door. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards. There was a single window, looking out toward the trees. In the corner, a reading chair, deep, soft, wrapped in a wool blanket, and beside it, a small round table with a teacup already set out. Empty, but waiting. Claire stepped inside, her breath catching just a little. "I remember," Daniel said quietly, "you once told me, if there was ever a place meant for thinking about tomorrow, it would need two things: sunlight and a place to sit." She turned to him slowly. "I didn't forget," he added. She didn't reply, but her hands, usually so composed, rested over her chest for a second, as if steadying something fragile and full. They moved to the back deck next. The lake stretched out wide and still, dotted with ducks drifting near the reeds. The trees lining the shore were starting to let go of their leaves one by one, quietly, like they didn't want to disturb the water below. Daniel leaned on the railing, not watching the lake, watching her. "I'm not asking you to move in," he said. "Not today, not like that." She turned, brows slightly raised, half smiling. "I'm not asking for forever, either," he continued. "I've made that mistake before. Assuming time is something we can promise." Claire stepped closer. "But," he said, "if you ever felt like staying, if there came a day when coming here didn't feel like visiting, I'd want this to be ours, not just mine. Ours." Claire looked away, not because she didn't believe him, but because she did. The wind picked up slightly. A few yellow leaves skittered across the deck like children playing tag. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the water. Inside, the kettle clicked off. They hadn't even realized it had been turned on. She followed Daniel back through the house, through the kitchen, and paused again at that room with the reading chair. Without speaking, she stepped inside, sat down slowly, ran her fingers along the curved wooden armrest. The light shifted slightly across the floor, painting her feet in gold. Daniel stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, not moving. Claire didn't give him an answer. She didn't need to, because sometimes saying yes is as simple as sitting down in the place you want to stay. And sometimes love doesn't need a question to exist. It just needs space and sunlight and a chair that's been waiting all along. Not all love stories end with a wedding. Some begin with a quiet yes, whispered in the way we choose to stay. It was a winter morning, the kind where everything felt still, like the world was wrapped in a soft wool blanket and told to rest. Outside, the lake had frozen over, smooth and pale, and snow fell in slow, unhurried flakes, quiet dancers against the gray sky. Inside, the warmth hummed gently. The radiator clicked once, then fell silent again. A low jazz tune played on the old radio in the corner, something with soft saxophone and a rhythm that didn't ask for attention. Claire stirred beneath the quilt, not rushed, not groggy, just present. The scent reached her first: cinnamon, a touch of nutmeg, something familiar and gentle waffles, maybe, or banana bread. She smiled before her eyes were even open. She didn't get up immediately. She lay there for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of a floorboard, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug, the quiet hum of someone turning a page. When she finally rose, the wooden floor was cool beneath her feet, and the air carried that unmistakable peace only found in homes that are truly lived in. She padded down the hall in thick socks, pulling a cardigan around her shoulders. Daniel was in the living room. He sat in the armchair by the window, the one that caught the morning light best. His reading glasses were perched low on his nose, a worn paperback in his hand. He wore an old navy sweater, a little frayed at the cuffs, and his hair was slightly mussed. Beside him, steam curled from a mug of black tea. He didn't notice her at first. That, Claire thought, was the magic of it. He wasn't performing. He wasn't waiting. He was simply being. And he looked so profoundly at home. She crossed the room without a word, wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested her cheek lightly against the curve of his shoulder. Daniel stilled, then closed his book, placing it gently on the side table. He didn't turn around. He didn't ask anything. He simply reached up and covered her hands with his. No questions. No need for them. This was her answer. This was her yes. After a while, he lifted one of her hands and pressed a soft kiss to the back of it. Neither of them said, "I love you." They didn't need to. Love was in the tea he'd made strong, just how she liked it. Love was in the extra blanket folded on her chair. Love was in the silence they shared, where nothing had to be filled. They moved into the kitchen, still quiet. Claire poured tea while Daniel plated the waffles. There was no talk of plans, no lists, no emails, just 2 mugs, 2 plates, 2 people. They sat at the table near the window, facing the lake. Snow continued to fall, soft as ash. In the distance, a deer picked its way through the trees, careful and calm. Claire sipped her tea slowly. "I used to think love had to be loud," she said finally, her voice low, like fireworks, or declarations, or dramatic moments on doorsteps. Daniel smiled, resting his chin in one hand. And now. She glanced around the kitchen, at the soft light, at him. "I think love is just knowing someone will still be there when the tea gets cold." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, they sat for a long while, watching snow fall, sharing waffles, saying everything without speaking. Later, Claire stood by the window again, fingers tracing the fog on the glass. Outside, the trees stood bare but unafraid, and she thought of all the ways she had once measured worth achievement, control, keeping things together, and how none of that had mattered in the end. Because what she remembered most from this chapter of her life wouldn't be the speeches, or the conferences, or the titles behind her name. It would be mornings like this, music low, tea warm, a quiet kind of love that asked for nothing but presence. She turned toward Daniel, who was now placing a record on the turntable jazz again, something older than both of them, and in her chest, where once there had been a hollow space too delicate to touch, there was now something whole, not perfect, not unbreakable, but real. And that, she realized, was enough. Not all stories need an ending. Some just need a place to rest, a home that waits without pressure, a chair in sunlight, and someone who brings peace, even in silence. Sometimes, the most powerful love stories aren't about grand gestures or perfect timing. They're about quiet choices. This story reminds us that love can come softly, even after years of silence. It teaches us that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a hand reaching across a plane seat, a cup of tea shared in the early morning, or a place made warm simply because someone stayed. For those of us who have lost, who have been afraid to begin again, this is a reminder. You don't have to be whole to be loved. You don't need to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to let someone in, even if only a little at first. And sometimes, home isn't a house. It's a person who sees the quiet parts of you and chooses them. In a world that often rushes love, this story is a quiet invitation to slow down, to feel, to trust, and to believe, even gently, that the best parts of life may still be ahead. Because it's never too late to begin again with someone who waits, not with noise, but with peace. Thank you for spending your time with us and letting this story whisper its way into your heart. If it touched you even in a small, quiet way, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that heal, connect, and remind us that we're never too old or too lost to feel something real again. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and keep listening for the quiet stories